We tend to think of fast food as a 20th century invention. But walk into pretty much any medieval city and people were already doing it. No cooking, no dishes, just hand over a coin and eat standing up in the street. They sold everything from roast meat to sweet wafers, to something called a rissole, which, once it's fried and dusted with sugar, is basically the medieval great-great-grandfather of a hand pie. Or, if you squint, a McDonald's apple pie with better ancestry. Today, we're stepping into a medieval cookshop to find out what grabbing lunch on the go looked like 600 years before anyone invented a drive-through window. This is Savoring History. Here's the thing, modern people always get backwards about the Middle Ages. We assume everyone cooked over a hearth, stirring some ancestral stew. In reality, most city dwellers couldn't cook at home, even if they wanted to. Tax records from Colchester in 1301 show that a mere 3% of households owned anything resembling a kitchen. Plenty of families didn't even own a pot, which, if you think about it, is a genuinely rough way to find out you're having takeout again tonight. So what did you do? You went out. Every town of any size had a street, sometimes literally nicknamed Cook's Row, lined with lean-to stalls and mobile card ovens turning out hot food all day. Paris had its own soundtrack of vendors. A 13th century writer named Guillaume de Villeneuve catalogued the cries echoing through the streets. Mashed peas, meat pies, garlic sauce, wedges of champagne and brie. And at night, baskets of wafers and waffles wrapped under a white cloth sold sweet or savory depending on your mood. Yes, there were savory fish waffles. No, I am not making that up. And no, I don't think they're coming back. Now, it wasn't only the poor lining up at these stalls either. Picture a full company of knights clanking up to a cookshop counter, still half-dressed for battle, and the one in front trying to keep the order straight. 2 meat pies. No, wait. Was it 3 who wanted the ale, who's actually got the coin purse right now? While the rest of the company argues behind him about whose turn it is to pay. It's not so different from watching a group text try to agree on a pizza order. Some things about ordering food in a group have simply never changed. We actually have real testimony that this happened. A London chronicler named William Fitzstephen, a man who, on a much darker day, watched the murder of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, also wrote a loving tour of London around 1170. He describes a public cookshop on the riverbank stocked with roasted, fried, and boiled meat, fish of every size, coarser cuts for the poor and finer ones for the rich. His reasoning for why even wealthy households used it is delightfully familiar. If guests showed up tired and hungry, and nobody wanted to wait around for a proper meal to be cooked, you simply sent someone down to the cookshop, and whatever you wanted, goose, guinea hen, woodcock, was ready to go. It is, in the truest sense, 13th century takeout. Cookshops weren't full-service restaurants. Most specialized hard. Court records from Norwich in 1287 mention one shop that sold nothing but pork sausages and puddings, another that sold only cheese and egg custard, and, I have to assume out of pure stubbornness, one that sold exclusively mustard. Pies, though, were the universal constant. And here's a detail I love. You didn't have to buy a pie pre-made. You could walk to the butcher, buy your own cut of meat, then carry it over to the pie shop and have them wrap and bake it for you. It's not so far off from a custom you still find today. In parts of Syria, it's completely normal to bring your own fresh-cut meat straight from the butcher to your local pizza place and have them build a pizza around it. A kind of off-menu customization the shop is happy to do because a satisfied customer comes back. Medieval Londoners were doing their own version of that 600 years earlier. And a 1350 city ordinance even capped how much a cook could charge just for the baking. 1 penny to turn your own capon into a pasty, on pain of imprisonment if they overcharged you. Why go to the trouble at all, when a ready-made pie cost the same 7 pennies either way? I mean, I don't think it was about money, honestly. I think it was about knowing exactly what was in your pie. Because, as we're about to see, that was not a given. In 1351, a Londoner named Henry Peche bought 2 capon pasties from a cook named Henry de Passaway. He and his companions were hungry enough that they were most of the way through the first pie before anyone noticed something was badly wrong. They cracked open the second pie to check. And it was, in the court's own words, putrid and stinking, an abomination to mankind. This went to court. 8 independent cooks were summoned to examine the evidence and render a verdict. They sided with Peche. De Passaway spent a week in the pillory, and, in a detail that feels almost like performance art, the offending capon itself was carried through the streets ahead of him on the walk there. What's wild is that this wasn't a rigged system stacked against cooks. If those 8 inspectors had ruled the meat was fine, it would have been the accuser standing in the pillory instead. Someone was always going to the pillory that day. The only question was who. That tells you something about how seriously medieval cities took food fraud, because food wasn't a small expense you could shrug off. For much of the population, feeding yourself could eat up 70 to 80% of your wages. A single capon pasty, at 7 pennies against a laborer's daily wage of 2 or 3, could represent close to 3 days of work. Now, 7 pennies was the price for a proper capon pasty, big enough to actually feed a family made with a whole large bird. Most people weren't buying that. There were cheaper options too. Smaller penny pies made with less expensive cuts, priced to be within reach of ordinary laborers. But even those weren't guaranteed to stay affordable, because medieval food prices were surprisingly fragile. When a harvest failed, city governments didn't just sit back and watch prices spiral. In 1379, London actually ordered pie sellers to start baking beef pasties at a halfpenny, half the usual price, and to make them, in the wording of the ordinance, just as good as the full-price version. Break that rule, and the fine was 80 pence, roughly half a mark, which for a working cook was a genuinely brutal hit to take. And that, more than almost anything else, explains why cooks kept getting hauled into court for cutting corners. If the city was going to force your prices down during a bad year, and your margins were already razor thin, the temptation to quietly swap venison for beef or slip in meat you should have thrown out must have been enormous. It doesn't excuse Henry de Passaway's rotten capon, but it does explain the environment that produced so many of these cases in the first place. Rotten meat wasn't even the worst accusation a cook could face. Reheating old food was treated as a near moral failing, because it was almost always a way to disguise something that should have been thrown out days earlier. Some towns went further and banned cooks from buying up leftovers from wealthy households, since by the time that food reached a cook's shop, it could have been sitting around for who knows how long. This actually reminds me of a story from my own family. My father trained as a chef in the 1930s and later cooked for the Royal Navy during the war. And he had his own honest way of handling leftovers, no deception involved. He'd take whatever meat was left over, sometimes canned meat stretched with mashed potato to make it go further, coat it in flour, egg, and breadcrumbs, and fry it up as little meat cakes to feed his 7 brothers and sisters. Same basic instinct as a medieval cook eyeing yesterday's roast. Stretch what you have, just done in the open, instead of quietly folded into someone else's dinner. medieval courts weren't nearly as forgiving of the sneaky version. Chaucer clearly had strong feelings about it too. In the Canterbury Tales, the cook Roger of Ware runs a shop crawling with flies, sells pastry so soggy it barely holds together, and is called out by name for selling pies that had been, in Chaucer's words, heated twice and cooled twice. Reheated food, immortalized in verse as a warning label. By Fort 1924, York had passed an ordinance specifically barring the wives of other tradesmen from baking, boiling, or roasting food for public sale unless they were properly trained. Because when something went wrong, the head cook would often try to pin the blame on an assistant or wife helping out in the kitchen. The buck, legally, was never allowed to actually stop there. We actually have a first-hand account of what it felt like to walk into this world as an outsider with no money. It's a poem from around 1450 called London Lickpenny, the story of a poor countryman from Kent who comes into the city and is immediately swarmed by food vendors the second he arrives. He gets to Westminster Gate and cooks are already on him, offering bread, ale, wine, fine cuts of beef. He pushes on into London itself, and it just keeps going. Someone shouting about hot peas, someone else selling strawberries and cherries. One vendor tries to sell him pepper and saffron, which tells you something interesting all on its own. Exotic spice being hawked on a street corner to a broke traveler, not locked away in some noble's pantry. But he can't afford any of it. Not the spice, not the meat. Not even the hot pies and mead being sold a few streets over. He leaves London with an empty stomach and an empty purse. And honestly, the poem is basically a 600-year-old complaint about how everything in the big city costs too much. Which is a feeling I think a lot of people visiting London today would still recognize. Even people who did have a kitchen at home ended up at cookshops constantly. And travel is a big reason why. On June 1st, 1267, a nobleman named Sir Roger Leyburn arrived in Canterbury with a full company of knights, straight off the road from France. Their first stop wasn't an inn or a private meal. It was the local cook shop, where they bought 68 capon pasties for 16 shillings and twopence. That's not a snack. That's catering for an army that just happened to be wearing armor instead of name tags. The other big reason was events. Unless your household happened to include an actual castle, your kitchen was never going to feed 100 wedding guests, or a funeral gathering, or a guild dinner. So you called in professionals, and in England, France, and much of the rest of Europe, cooks' guilds actually made this mandatory. If you were hosting one of these large events, you were legally required to use their catering services. Picking a cook shop with a solid reputation wasn't a nice to have. It was step one of wedding planning. So today we're making a rissole, essentially a medieval hand pie, pulled from a 14th century French household manual called Le Ménager de Paris. Savory versions existed with pork, chestnut and egg, even pike and eel. But I'm making the sweet version: fig, roasted apple, raisin, and warm spice, bound in a saffron pastry and fried until golden. This was not poor cookshop food. Sugar and imported spice put it firmly on the fancier end of the menu. For the pastry, you'll need 2½ cups, or 300 grams, of flour, 12 tablespoons, or 170 grams, of cold butter cut into small cubes, a 1/4 cup, or 60 milliliters, of water, and a small pinch of saffron. For the filling, 1/2 cup, or 120 grams, of dried figs, a 1/4 cup, or 30 grams, of raisins, 6 medium apples, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon each of ginger and nutmeg, 1/2 cup, or 100 grams, of sugar, 1 teaspoon of salt, and 1/2 cup, or 60 grams, of chopped walnuts, almonds, or hazelnuts. You'll also want a few inches of frying fat in a deep pot. Lard would be the historically accurate choice, but any neutral oil works fine. Start by dropping the saffron into your water and letting it sit for about 5 minutes so it can bleed its color. While that steeps, sift the flour into a large bowl, add the cold butter, and work it in with your fingertips until the mixture looks sandy. No visible chunks of butter left. Pour in the saffron water and bring it together quickly into a dough. You don't want to overwork it. Wrap it and let it rest somewhere cool for 10 to 15 minutes while you build the filling. Chop the figs small and combine them with the raisins, then let them soak for about an hour. Plain water works, though a 14th century English recipe for this style of filling calls for soaking in wine, so that's the road I'm taking. While that soaks, core the apples, halve them, and roast at 350 degrees or 175 degrees for about 30 minutes until soft. Let them cool, then chop them down the same way as the figs. Whisk the spices, salt, and sugar together in a large bowl. Then fold in the roasted apple along with the drained figs and raisins. A lot of the surviving recipes describe grinding this down into more of a paste than a chunky filling, so that's what I'm doing. Working it through a mortar until smooth, then stirring the chopped nuts back in for a bit of texture. Divide the rested dough into about a dozen even pieces and roll each one out on a floured surface into a rough circle, roughly 1/8 of an inch thick. Spoon a couple tablespoons of filling into the center, leaving a good border of bare dough. Fold it over into a half moon and crimp the edge shut with a fork. Heat your frying fat to 350 degrees or 175 degrees, and lower in 3 or 4 rissoles at a time, keeping them moving so they don't scorch on one side. About 5 minutes gets you a deep golden color. Pull them onto a rack to drain, and while they're still hot, dust them with sugar. That's the finishing touch that marks these as a nicer cookshop item rather than a poor man's version. Okay, that is genuinely one of the best things I've made on this channel. The pastry shatters. The filling tastes like an apple pie that went to finishing school. And there's a warmth from the spice that a modern apple pie just doesn't have. If this is what medieval fast food tasted like at the nicer stalls, I understand exactly why people were willing to pay for it. There's an old proverb that gets thrown around in cookshop records. An evil cook is one who won't lick his own lips. Meaning, if the cook won't eat what he's selling, why would you? By that measure, I'm in the clear, because I could eat about 6 more of these. If you want the full written recipe, it's linked below. And if you liked hanging out in a 14th century cookshop with me, there's a lot more where that came from. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Savoring History.